Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate everybody being here today. So excuse me, I'm a little frazzled. I didn't get this done until about 5 in the morning. My name is Peter Joseph, and I'm very happy to be here today. And I thank you all for coming. Now, this is a very heavy and dense program. I hope everyone can focus. It's a scripted talk, as the level of precision needed to get these ideas across coherently, frankly, doesn't come natural to me, and I suspect you'll see why in a moment. It moves fast, and it's kind of advanced in certain ways, so please keep notes if you don't understand something or if you disagree with something, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. Post-scarcity economics and the end of capitalism. Let's start with some history. Perhaps the two most paradigm-shifting events in history have been the Neolithic Revolution some 12,000 years ago and the Industrial Revolution some 200 years ago. Both of these mark great transitions in socioeconomic organization, not to mention the dramatic effects on overall culture. If you think deeply about it, there's really no other greater influence on our lives. The orientation of an economy is the ultimate systemic starting point of what defines a civilization and its characteristics. The Neolithic Revolution, with its introduction of agriculture, animal domestication, fixed settlements, and eventually the creation of the nation-state, was a dramatic shift from the meandering hunter-gatherer tribes of the pre-Neolithic period. And with the birth of such new methods of environmental control, new preconditions and consequences naturally followed. In the words of anthropologist and professor of neurology Dr. Robert Sapolsky of Stanford University, hunter-gatherers had thousands of wild sources of food to subsist on. Agriculture changed all of that, generating an overwhelming reliance on a few dozen food sources. Agriculture allowed for the stockpiling of surplus resources and thus inevitably the unequal stockpiling of them. Stratification of society and the invention of classes. Thus, it has also allowed for the invention of poverty. As an aside, it's often argued that humans back then were actually in a strange, unique balance with nature. The economic variables in play were quite simple. There was no possibility of, for example, resource overshoot, environmentally destabilizing pollution, or eviscerating atomic bombs. Humans existed at the mercy of what nature provided on its own, and hence homeostasis was a natural outcome. Now, what was the Neolithic Revolution more fundamentally? It was, of course, really a technological revolution, something everybody in this room is familiar with. Being able to actually grow food is a technological advent. And this is worth noting because if you look closely, all relevant changes in society have been preceded by advancements in science and technology. It is perhaps the driving mechanism of cultural evolution, even though we tend not to see it that way. For example, if you look at the long history of abject slavery, you will notice that alleviation of this age-old institution happened more or less in tandem with the application of improved labor technologies. While we like to believe it was some moral epiphany that stopped it, abject slavery wasn't really eradicated until the emerging machine age around the Industrial Revolution. Even today, the most oppressed and exploited in global society, such as the 27 million people who are still locked into ancient systems of debt bondage and subjugation, along with the hundreds of millions working in inhumane sweatshop conditions, they all exist in regions marked by low technological capacity. Something to think about. Now, this is an important chart, and as it shows, average historical incomes, which are found to be deeply correlated to technological progress, of course, went pretty much nowhere for the 11 to 12,000 years following the Neolithic Revolution. In the words of economic historian Gregory Clark, the average person in the world of 1800 was no better off than the average person of 100,000 BC. Indeed, in 1800, the bulk of the world's population was poorer than their remote ancestors. The lucky denizens of wealthy societies, such as 18th century England or the Netherlands, managed the material lifestyle equivalent to that of the Stone Age. But the vast swath of humanity in East and South Asia, particularly in China and Japan, eked out a living under conditions probably significantly poorer than those of cavemen. It's interesting. He states poorer because, again, as noted by the Robert Sapolsky quote prior, the new model of settled and agrarian society created a precondition for inequality that simply wasn't even possible before. The Neolithic Revolution, while of course helping certain pockets of society, actually hurt other pockets, effectively creating economic classes, something we still deal with today. Now, this long period of minimal progress has been termed the Malthusian trap, only to be broken by what is called now the Great Divergence by many, marked essentially by the Industrial Revolution in Europe around the late 19th century. The Malthusian trap is named after a man named Thomas Malthus, an economist born in 1766. He is considered one of the foundational classical economic philosophers, alongside people like John Locke and Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Malthus's conclusions are pretty simple. All life-supporting resources, namely food production, increase only at an arithmetic rate, while human population increases at a geometric rate. Therefore, population growth will always outpace the means of survival. So, in short, the Malthusian trap is an ebb and flow between population and income. Income, the means of survival. When income increased, the population would reproduce faster and eventually overshoot resource production, resulting in die-offs. Once the die-offs occur, the process would cycle again, locking society into a fairly static condition of population growth and die-offs. There simply wasn't enough economic efficiency to break the pattern for a long, long time. It's interesting to note that Malthus even went so far to suggest that any attempts to alleviate poverty, such as programs attempted by state government like we see today, they should end. He considered the existence and fatality of the poor as a law of nature, and hence there would always be a subculture in the human species that must constantly die off for the greater good. And this observation was embraced by all the classical economists of his time. If you read Adam Smith, Ricardo, and their predecessors, this presupposition is built directly into their economic perspectives. And it makes sense, honestly, because this is exactly what they experienced. And of course, when Charles Darwin alluded to his ever misunderstood social Darwinism phenomenon in evolution, these perspectives were further reinforced, justifying not only the acceptance of large-scale inequality and poverty, but also wars of conquest, imperialism, and subjugation. However, around the late 19th century, something very dramatic happened, something human society has still been unable to fully grasp as far as implications. The Malthusian trap was broken. Historians are still not exactly sure what happened, probably related to oil, but a staggering and rapid increase in productivity and resulting incomes and population took hold. And this started the Great Divergence, and it is where we are today. We are in the midst of one of the most dramatic shifts in human productive capacity in history, and it appears to be just the beginning. I suspect many of you know who Ray Kurzweil is and his work discussing the phenomenon of Moore's Law, which is the exponential increase in computing power over time, extending the logic to overall technological and scientific progress. In short, once a given approach or task becomes an information technology, meaning essentially the use of computers to assist technical design and development, those developments start to become exponential in their progress as well. This pattern is now occurring in almost every intellectual discipline, rapidly increasing developments and breakthroughs, from genetics to physics to engineering to biology, you name it. Anything that is incorporating computer intelligence to problem solving and technological development will likely experience or has experienced an exponential or near exponential increase in problem solving and advancement. It's truly a fascinating thing. And if you're not familiar with it, I hope you can look into this. Now, more importantly, within this phenomenon is a grand feature of economic relevance. It's called ephemeralization. It's a term coined by R. Buckminster Fuller, and in short, ephemeralization has to do with the fact that we can do more and more and more with less and less and less. A completely counterintuitive reality, as most of us think, arithmetically when it comes to system output. In other words, if you need an engine to be more powerful than a prior engine, we intuitively expect the engine to be larger, heavier, and use more resources. So we think in terms of equal arithmetic proportions, and ephemeralization completely contradicts that intuition. For example, of course, the first computer, invented a mere 60 years ago, took up almost 2,000 square feet, weighed almost 30 tons, and took so much power to operate, the city lights in Philadelphia reportedly dimmed during its operation. And of course, today, the tiny chip in your smartphone is many, many times faster and obviously quite smaller, taking virtually no real power, more with less. This is the new economic trend, and this ephemeralization effect stands in direct contradiction of the Malthusian premise. And it is this basic mechanism that will lead to a post-scarcity society, a society focused on managing abundance, not preserving scarcity, which is what we do today, if, and I emphasize if, we are vulnerable enough, sensitive enough to actually allow it to come to fruition. And that's why I'm talking to you all today. You see, market capitalism developed out of the Malthusian worldview. It is predicated on a set of presuppositions that, as I will explain, are simply no longer viable given the emerging technological and scientific trends at hand. Everything the market expects in its system structure is being turned upside down, contradicted, or made obsolete. The problem at hand today is that we have a system clash, and the longer the outdated assumptions and related archaic practices of capitalism persist, all the current amazing trends of technological innovation will, in the long run, I'm not saying there aren't temporal advancements here that help certain people in certain pockets, but in the long run, will merely assist speeding up the destruction of the planet while increasing domestic and global conflict and general destabilization. All of which, however, before I go into all that, we need to talk about systems, something we humans intuitively have a really hard time with. System behavior. System behavior is by definition output behavior that is unpredicted by the behavior of its parts, taken separately. This is a very profound understanding. It's utterly counter to our intuition and our five-sense reality. We assume our behavior and intention stands on its own, for example. And if we mean well in this system, then we can't possibly be part of something hurting others or something that's destructive to the planet. The truth is that we're involved in a larger order economic framework, and that framework has its own structural logic. This is why statistical analysis and the scientific method have become so critical to our progress in the last century. We can see through the clouds now and all the illusions that our limited perception and small brains create. For example, I don't think anyone here in Los Angeles wishes for there to be over 80,000 homeless people here on the streets every single night. Yet every day people go to their jobs and with the best of intentions on average, participate in a system that creates and tacitly supports the existence of those 80,000 homeless people. It is a system consequence, and it has nothing to do with your intention. In fact, there's a huge spectrum of system outputs that no one intends, and classical economic theory conveniently embraces them in the term externality. Externalities are outcomes that result from the economic system but are not taken into account by the economic system and hence are outside of the system's comprehension. They're just ignored. Notable modern externalities include pollution, climate change, technological unemployment, poverty, resource overshoot, biodiversity destruction, irreversible scarcity, wealth inequality, and even public health itself. That's right. Public health is actually not factored into the current economic model. It is completely and utterly external. So the market system has no structural responsibility to ensure anyone's well-being. We simply assume the system will output the desired result, which, as I will describe at length, is actually not at all what the system is doing, especially at this stage of its evolution, as we have been out of the Malthusian period that it was born from for a very long time. The truth is that this system is now making, on the whole, on average, in the long run, and will continue to do so, it is making society sicker at an increasing rate and destroying the environment. Now, since the market system itself has no mechanism to resolve its own negative byproducts, society has been conditioned to assume that such external issues, again, such as inequality, poverty, pollution, and the like, these must be moral problems. They must be ethical problems, right? It isn't the system, it's the people. This is the most prevalent delusion we hear today throughout basic traditional economic theory and, of course, the general media, this very truncated view of causality. So apparently now we're supposed to have a green market economy led by social entrepreneurs, encouraging consumers to use their purchases to vote out abusive labor practices and inhumanity. We've heard all this stuff. It assumes that a sustainable and humane economy is simply a matter of moral focus, and as stated, nothing could be further from the truth. It isn't about your intentions. It is about what the system is programmed to do. And the market system, which was cultivated during a very low energy, highly arduous, hideously elitist, and stratified period during the Malthusian trap, is not going to change its built-in structural logic and outcomes just because people think they mean well and are being ethical within it. Now, so that's stated, let's now take a deeper look at the actual structure of this Malthusian system we call the market economy, and why modern pressures and conditions are now pushing this system to complete and utter social destruction. There are really only three core structural mechanisms in play in the market economy. Really obvious, but we need to go through this because the great failure, I think, of human thought is we forget the obvious. The most profound understandings, I really believe, are the most obvious in front of us. We just get diluted and we forget the most obvious stuff. Anyway, enough of that. The first is labor for income. The whole global economy is based first and foremost on employment. This is how people gain money to survive, spending back into the system, keeping it going. The second is that all resources, goods, and services have property value, transferred by means of monetary exchange. Obvious enough. Everything is bought and sold through the use of money, mediated by the collective market network itself. And third, we have the structural incentive strategy. This is based upon competition for demand, whether person to person or institution to institution, all oriented around the interest to A, save money on production, and B, maximize profits upon final sales. This is the basic gaming logic inherent to the system. And if you don't strategize in this way, outdoing your competitors who are strategizing the exact same way, you will likely fail. That's really it, if you really think about it. However, when you set this simple set of rules in motion, especially in the modern, post-Malthusian world of today, a very problematic set of systemic outcomes result. And in this, I'm going to speak of three great incompatibilities. Incompatibility one, it's structurally unsustainable. If the market system requires labor for income, then what creates demand for labor? The answer is the act of consumption. Consumption is the expression of consumer demand. But of course, consumers can't buy anything, regardless of what they want, unless they have income or purchasing power. And where does income come from? It comes from labor in some form. So, at the root level of economic function is this simple process of what could be termed cyclical consumption. If consumption rates go down, then GDP drops. People lose jobs, and the economy contracts or stagnates. If consumption rates increase, labor demand increases, jobs are created, and the economy grows. It really is that simple. So consumption is like the gas pedal on a car. The most optimized condition of market economics is one of expansion. A thriving market economy is one that turns over quickly, using more and more resources, creating more and more demand, and ideally more and more jobs. Faster, better. More and more is better. Does anyone here see a major structural problem? Last I checked, we lived on a finite planet with finite resources in a generally closed ecosystem. And yet the market structure psychotically pushes infinite consumption. In fact, punishing any acts of conservation, sustainability, or true technical efficiency, because those that do care are going to suffer in their acquisition of market share. Estimates now find, for example, that humanity will need 27 more Earths by 2050 to meet demand. Other examples: the rampant, severe biodiversity loss is not only disrupting our basic biosphere functions, it's now a fact that virtually all life support systems are in decline, with 50% of all wildlife having been destroyed in the past 40 years alone. I'm always amused when I see these headlines: the EPA's latest threat to economic growth, attacking the EPA for its interest to try and improve quality standards. Well, we can't have that, right? Not if it hurts business. That's a no-no. It doesn't matter. Forget the environment. We have to keep making money. However, I want to point out one of my favorite admissions as far as resource overshoot and biodiversity loss, and it was made in the 2010 Convention of Biological Diversity report. In 2002, 192 countries got together and agreed to work to slow biodiversity loss, only to come back 8 years later completely defeated, stating none of the 21 sub-targets accompanying the overall target of significantly reducing the rate of biodiversity loss by 2010 can be said definitively to have been achieved globally. Actions to promote biodiversity receive a tiny fraction of funding compared to infrastructure and industrial developments. Moreover, biodiversity considerations are often ignored when such developments are designed. Most future scenarios project continuing levels of extinctions and loss of habitats throughout the century. Well, does anyone see the absurdity of that statement? Of course it receives a tiny fraction of funding compared to infrastructure and industrial developments. Why? Because preserving biodiversity, preserving anything, does not feed the structural appetite of the market economy. It doesn't do anything. There's no direct reward to care and to do anything in a conservative way. We don't want to preserve resources in the market. We don't want to preserve habitats, solve problems, or reduce, obviously, we don't want to reduce consumption in general. It is antithesis of what the market needs. So returning back to my historical context, and this is important because I get this question a lot, why is this occurring now? You know, we hear this argument, it's frequent, it says, well, you know, we used to have a good market. We see the market over in this country doing much better. We lose the synergy and the evolution of what's happened over time. The market has changed and actually behaves in a different way across the world through different synergetic aspects. No country is working alone in its own market economy. It is a global market, and it creates different extremes throughout the world. But that's for another conversation. This is interesting because even though we've had the market for centuries and centuries, we have not had huge ecological problems. And why is that? Well, it's really obvious, because before the Great Divergence, there simply wasn't enough productive efficiency to allow for this characteristic to express itself. 300 years ago, a shoemaker could produce maybe a few pairs of decent quality shoes a day. Today, a common automated shoe factory can produce a pair every 30 seconds, or about 4,000 a day. See, the market can't understand all this productivity and efficiency. It's causing a kind of systemic malfunction. And to compensate for this, all sorts of neurotic system perversions have been made to try and re-emphasize the scarcity worldview. Because again, this is a Malthusian-based economic structure. For example, planned obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is the calculated withholding of efficiency to assure repeat purchases, and this technique can even be found in old industrial design textbooks, even though no one likes to talk about it. When Apple Computer plans for its new line of fetish technology, it does so by doing an analysis of how many times it can get the public to buy the same products from them over and over again, with planned stages of release and various developments. They're thinking way ahead. It's marketing. And in a world where we are now using the world's resources, the annual output of the world's resources in 8 months, do you think it's wise to strategically design goods to break down and become obsolete as fast as possible? Another issue is simply modern advertising itself and its culmination. In the early 20th century, the application of new machine technology was further increasing industrial productivity in an unprecedented way, again extending this great divergence, and it was quickly realized that production surplus was now outpacing existing demand. Early American society was very puritanical in a sense. They did not have some overarching consumption need like we do today. So, people like Edward Bernays were brought in by industry leaders to literally change American culture. This process was based not on informing the public of the utility of a new product, but to manipulate one's social nature to think they needed the item to gain acceptance and have status. And it worked. An ethic of overt consumerism linking people's identity to their property and status has been an enormously successful social engineering program. Today, people in America consume twice as much per capita as they did before World War II. They work more hours and they have enormous amounts of consumer debt. Not to mention, companies spend more money today on advertising a good than the actual creation of it. That, in and of itself, blows my mind. If you really think about the ramifications of that, it alludes to a powerful distortion. And as an aside, I find it amusing when I read these kind of free market behavioral theories, such as the notion of the rational and informed consumer. Rational and informed consumer? Advertising's grand success comes from deliberately misleading the public, focusing on irrational and impulsive weaknesses common to human psychology. Anyway, these are just some of the distorted ways the system has tried to adapt to the rapid rise in productivity and abundance. Today, this neurotic condition can be summarized by one simple paradox. The market justifies its existence by the recognition of the need to manage scarcity, but due to its structural mechanics, these ancient structural mechanics, it actually promotes and rewards infinite consumption. It is a giant black hole, and it will never stop, and it doesn't matter what your intentions are. And this leads me to the second great incompatibility. Technological unemployment. This one's a lot of fun. I was asked recently in an interview what I thought about the $15 an hour minimum wage raise proposal, the fast food raise, as it's been called. And I replied that it was irrelevant in the long run. And the interviewer was quite confused and actually got kind of indignant. They expected me to, jump on board. So I explained that these wage increases in that sector of the economy will do nothing but further incentivize something restaurants have been contemplating for a long, long time. And that is the full automation of menial jobs. And just watch, I guarantee it. I give it 3 years max before one major fast food chain sets the cost efficiency precedent, and like dominoes, the rest will follow. Labor simply can't win in this equation. It will become too cheap. Now, for those unfamiliar with the history of technological unemployment, it was made popular by a famous economist named John Maynard Keynes when he said in 1930, "We are being afflicted with a new disease of which some readers may not yet have heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outpacing the pace at which we can find new uses for labor." But this is only a temporary phase of maladjustment. All this means is that in the long run, mankind is solving its economic problem. It will all happen gradually. We shall endeavor to spread the bread thin on the butter to make what work there is still to be done to be as widely shared as possible, sharing work. 3-hour shifts or a 15-hour work week may put off the problem for a great while. Now, his comments on this are quite vague, really. But they appear to suggest, or they set the seed for two major historical fallacies regarding this issue. It assumes that the market economy essentially is, it assumes the market economy is equipped, I should say, to handle this new advent of machine automation becoming cheaper and more efficient than human labor. The first we could call the Luddite fallacy. The Luddite fallacy was a response that basically said that new technology doesn't destroy jobs, it just changes the composition of jobs in the economy. Put another way, for every job lost due to technology, a new job is assumed to take its place, usually in some new capacity. And while this perspective may have seemed viable during early periods of slow technological change, the ever-exponential advancement of automation today is now far outpacing the creation of new human-exclusive labor roles. And it is simply a matter of time before it becomes more cost-effective, reliable and productive, safer in all economic fields. It's just a matter of time. And there are numerous corroborating studies showing the capacity of automation, including the conclusion that right now, over half of the world's jobs can be mechanized. Furthermore, human employment is now actually inverse to productivity in most cases, meaning it not only removes jobs because it's cheaper, it increases output efficiency greatly. Here's a classic charted example from manufacturing. The blue line is the increase in production, and the red line is human employment. The second fallacy is the assumption that this shift will happen so gradually we'll be able to figure out ways to compensate for it through time, such as sharing the job market, or reducing work hours and raising wages. Perhaps even mass-produced abundance will create cost savings that will trigger deflation in currency value, and eventually you'll have an equilibrium consistently morphing where, say, $1,000 will enable you to buy a $200,000 home in a financial equivalency today. And this has been talked about, this is actually talked about a lot these days. You hear a lot of this coming from like the Austrian school. They say, oh, we're just going to keep adjusting all the economic metrics. It's going to happen naturally. The market will take care of it. Well, if this is going to happen, then why hasn't it happened to some degree in the past 50 years of this ever-increasing productivity? Actually, the opposite has happened. Today, people work more than ever, and inflation keeps growing. Why hasn't it happened? Well, it's actually really obvious if you look at the mechanics of the way people are forced to think. The gaming strategy. Going back to number 3 regarding the characteristics of a market, the structural incentive strategy is based upon competition for demand, all oriented around the interest to A, save money on production, and B, maximize profits upon final sales. And these rules, when in dynamic system interplay, when they're set in motion, they systemically disallow the progression of spreading the wealth or reducing the work week, or reversing inflation, and the like. It really isn't that profound if you just think about it, when you think about what each individual player in aggregate is forced to do in order to keep the game going. And you'll see that the idea of this kind of trickle-down thing is just nonsense. For example, when a company like Amazon.com decides to automate its distribution center, removing human laborers, it does so in order to save money and increase profits, right? Yes. Now, it might reduce its fees to some effect, and it might even pay some of the other employees a little bit more. But the truth, really, is that they do this to simply be competitive against other producers in whatever way they need to keep going. The gaming logic has nothing to do with any kind of altruism. It has to do with how they can continue to maintain increased profits, high cost efficiency, or low input costs. And these mechanisms will continue to unfold regardless of any intention to spread the wealth. It's just assumed that way in this bogus trickle-down crap that we've been hearing about for years, which is firmly debunked in the general economic premise of it, and this new kind of technological or techno trickle-down effect that the equalization of the economy will occur with less work hours, higher wages, and deflation is equally as ridiculous. It's not going to happen. It hasn't happened, and I wish people would stop talking about it. And I'll put it even more so. It's further debunked. This is further debunked, not only by the fact that people are working more hours today and all that. It's further debunked by the fact that over the past few decades with huge advancements in productive efficiency, virtually all the growth we've seen, all the profit and wealth, has gone to the upper 1-2%. That's why the billionaires are flying and the wages are stagnating. That's why 1% of the world will own 50% of the planet's wealth in just a few years. They are absorbing all the value that has been generated by the exponential increase of productivity. And guess what? That is exactly what they are supposed to do, because that is what the game is designed to facilitate. Moving on. Great incompatibility number 3, public health. So far, I've talked about incompatibilities born out of the Malthusian market system as it clashes against modern technological society and its ever-increasing levels of efficiency. The incompatibility I want to talk about here is a little bit different. This clash has to do with the very core of our shared evolutionary psychology, or human nature itself. You know, declarations about what is or isn't human nature have been endless throughout history. Philosophers have constantly tried to assume humans are hardwired in certain ways, usually using those declarations as a way to justify the existing social order. And the Malthusian system of economics has been no exception. For example, we are told that we are inherently competitive, we are inherently greedy, and materially insatiable. We've all heard this stuff, and the truth of the matter is, as modern sociological science has put forward, and neurological science has put forward, is that we are many things at once. It is the social condition that brings out the behaviors required for a given circumstance. If we need to be competitive, we will be. That doesn't mean that we're always that way. The circumstance sets in motion because we have great neuroplasticity. The problem is we're stuck in a particular circumstance far too often. And this superficial type of work, these conclusions of the past, they've persisted because we really weren't able for a long time to conduct the type of statistical analysis needed, nor the neurological studies needed to make any really viable conclusions. It was just speculative observation. And the one area I want to focus on here is how the market system and its inevitable creation of wealth inequality, a core characteristic, has affected public health on the whole. And the conclusion to be found is that class stratification is one of the most destructive things you can do to human psychology and public health. Again, class stratification is one of the most consistent characteristics of market capitalism. When we think about health problems, it's historically assumed that problems occurring in the lower classes are caused by direct material conditions, such as bad housing or poor diets, lack of educational opportunities, and so on. This is not the whole story. If you compare groups of people with the same income brackets in different wealthy first world countries, you find that those in more unequal countries, those with the largest internal stratification, do much worse in health than those in more equal countries with the same income. So it doesn't matter in absolute terms, it's relative. Here's a chart about life expectancy. We see a specific sample set of wealthy countries ranked according to how much income inequality exists, along with the average life expectancy within. The y-axis is life expectancy in years, and the x-axis is income inequality from low to high. As you can see, Japan has the highest life expectancy and also the lowest income inequality, while Singapore has the greatest income inequality, topping only the United States. The regression line in the middle shows the trend. And as you can see, lower inequality translates into longer life. Drug use. Here we see the United States as having the highest level of inequality based on the sample set, while also being within the top 4 of countries with the most illegal drug use. Again, you can see the clear regression line showing the obvious relationship where increased inequality creates increased drug use. Mental illness. As you will see, mental illness is much more common in more unequal rich countries. In this sample, the U.S. leads the group in both mental illness and income inequality, while Japan, with the lowest level of inequality, has the least amount of mental illness. Levels of trust or social capital. As you can see in this chart, those that feel they can trust one another are much more common in societies with less inequality. This is pretty commonly assumed. It's really obvious. Anyway, mistrust and inequality obviously reinforce each other. We often don't think about trust as an issue of public health, but it actually is a very important one on the sociological level. Educational scores. Not only do more unequal countries have worse educational attainment, kids are also more likely to drop out of school as well. Homicide rates. As you can see, the United States blows every other relatively rich nation out of the water when it comes to homicide. In fact, violence itself is probably the most established attribute of social inequality than anything else. Rates of imprisonment, similar enough, much higher in unequal countries, of course. However, what's interesting about this is that it doesn't just relate to the rates of crime, it also has to do with the punitive attitudes, and this is fascinating. The more unequal the society, the harsher the punishments, or the more strict the laws are for a given offense, etc. More people are put into prison for longer periods of time than in more equal countries. I find that particularly disturbing. It means that deep class stratification makes the society mean. Social mobility. This is fun. Social mobility has to do, of course, with the class relationship you have at birth, and how easy it is for you to move up out of that class during your life. And as you can see by this chart, the United States, home of the American dream and the highest manifestation of capitalism, of course, has the lowest social mobility rate of all the countries sampled. This list goes on and on. Infant mortality, higher in more unequal countries. Obesity, higher in more equal countries. Teenage birth rates, higher in more equal countries, etc. And here is a summation chart of the points we've just examined. It shows life expectancy, math literacy, infant health, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teen birth rates, trust, obesity, mental illness, drugs and alcohol use, and social mobility. And as you can see, the United States, with its high level of stratification, the ultimate embodiment of capitalism in its truest form, as most would admit, is the absolute worst in the entire world when it comes to first world countries. And by the way, the reason they sample first world nations is because it's a phenomenon that exists where there's a lot of difference happening in incomes, of course, a certain type of difference. For example, you can't go into a very poor country that still behaves in the, sort of the feudal era. The samples don't work because, well, actually most of those countries, the vast majority of people are already in such deprivation, they're not even aware, frankly, of how they're deprived. So if you want to read more about that, it's very fascinating. You can read the book The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett.